Hey, good morning, and welcome into this week's long form episode here on Mining Stock Daily. Trevor Hall, your host once again. We've got two guests here in one segment, kind of a debrief from last week's trip down to Argentina to visit the Aldebaran's Altar project. So we're welcoming in two of the individuals I had the privilege of spending the entire week with. They'll remain anonymous, but Koala and also PauloMacro, two incredible minds here, not only on the mining side, but also in finance and macroeconomics. So it was a great trip, and it's been a few days since we all returned back home, so we were able to finally debrief about the trip and what we learned. So we're going to talk a little bit about the mining sector in Argentina, but really kind of what we experienced there on the ground, out in the rural countryside of Argentina, and also in Buenos Aires for a few days. So great big conversation regarding Argentina and the mining sector. Special thank you to Vizsla Silver and Caliber Mining for their continued support of the podcast here in Mining Stock Daily. And if you wouldn't mind, hit that like, subscribe, and share to your friends and like-minded people who might be interested in this sector. And given the move in copper, gold, silver lately, I think a few people are starting to perk up. All right, everybody, here's my debrief conversation with both Koala and PauloMacro. Enjoy. Have a great weekend. We'll be back on Monday. All right, everybody, welcome into this week's long form episode, and we've got a kind of a power-packed hour with you. Last week, as we were away from the podcast visiting our friends Aldebaran Resources down in Argentina, I just had the privilege of being joined by two wonderful people, wonderful individuals outside of markets, but just incredibly bright people within markets. And they will remain anonymous for the podcast, and you will recognize them. Obviously, Cloud Bear PauloMacro is joining us, and another some sort of from the bear family, the koala as well. So gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for finding the time to do this.
Awesome. Happy to be here.
Hello again, Trevor.
Good to see you, my friends. Okay, so we were going to try to do this at the end of the trip last week in Argentina, but because of just schedule was hectic and a lot of great insights, we decided to take a few days to record this debrief. And I thought we'd jump in really talking about Argentina. Koala, you've been there a few more times over the last couple of years, and we have, obviously being very active in the Vicuña district as an investor. Paulo, you have been investing in this sector as well, specifically in Argentina, but this was your first trip to the country. And so maybe I thought just maybe general discussion about what we witnessed. And Koala, we'll start with you. You've been there a few times, like I said. What maybe jumped out at you the most? What did you see? What did you witness that maybe changed from the last few times you've been to the country?
I'm flattered to go first, Trevor, but I think first impressions are more powerful. So how about I take this one last? I'd
Okay,
love to
sounds
hear
good.
what you guys thought first impressions wise for you guys seeing it.
Yeah.
Sure. From my perspective, and PauloMacro here. Thanks again, Trevor, for having me on, and it was great to travel with you and Koala last week. I have been to Argentina before, but in pre-college, pre-default 2001 as a kid, and fuzzy memories. Although some things did kind of connect back. I'd say that the kind of general takeaways that I took away from the trip, specifically to the Altar site with Aldebaran, which many of my readers will know is one of my largest personal investments, and certainly the largest position I have in the copper space across the board. But also the getting a sense between our meeting with the mining ministry on Friday when we were done with the tour, and then also mingling with some of the local expat business crowd, courtesy of our friend Dimitri Kofinas of the Hidden Forces Pod. The country is clearly moving in a different direction, anecdotal evidence, obviously, and anecdotes don't make a trend, but I spent the weekend running around the city as well, and I didn't smell recession. I smell a recovery. There's clearly a lot of road to fully recover from the harsh and deep adjustment that has happened in 2024 under Milei. And for me, the big risk here is continuity in terms of public sentiment, and the idea basically that what Milei has in his lap is so many decades of built up problems that an adjustment of 5 to 7 years is required, and he only has 4. So he needs to pack in the next 2 years enough momentum in the right direction in terms of a recovery to maintain a mandate for continuity that gives him the second term. And for me, the kind of bottom line here, to keep it short, is gringos like us with dollarized savings are feeling Argentina get more expensive, perversely at a time when inflation it has declined substantially over the last year. But the bottom end of society and the local Argentinian saver and worker have not felt the bump, so that you have like a sandwich that needs to converge from the top, which is the dollarized gringo who never even checked the menu price because everything was so cheap for so long. But the local that found everything expensive, he's still feeling like things are expensive, but somewhat less so. But his real wages haven't grown yet because of the vast unemployment created by Milei's chainsaw to government employees, over 60,000 unemployed over the last year. So the country needs investment to soak up the labor pool, increase real wages, and with that, sentiment will really turn for the better. And that plays into the mining space in attracting investment under RIGI, which we also discussed with Aldebaran Management. So we're kind of at a rubber meets the road point for Milei in the next 18 months. There's the congressional election in October, which hopefully will show his party moving in the right direction. Right now, he's kind of a man with a plan and a mandate for change, but no real party that he's constructed himself, obviously. But now his party will kind of put their stamp on government in October, assuming they get good buy-in. But it's an exciting time, and continuing to lay out reforms, removing capital controls at the end of the year may help devalue at the margin, so that the locals feel a bit of purchasing power coming back to goose that real wage as well. And then we'll see. But it's an exciting time to be looking at Argentina. I admittedly missed it, like many people. Once bitten, twice shy. The second mouse gets the cheese after the Macri blow up in 2019. But there's still a long road ahead, and good momentum here. So that's kind of my general takeaway.
Paulo, I just want to kind of jump on what you said. I think, I had never been to Argentina, and I think my first impression, at least spending time in Buenos Aires, was really like, they talk about Argentina being part of the emerging market, facilities. And I would push back on that. I mean, that city for 3.5 million people functioned really, really well. Traffic flowed, the city flowed really well. There was, if you needed to get around, it wasn't a problem, and it was, pretty clean and all that. I didn't have any preconceived notions going into it, but I was really impressed with the city of that size, just kind of how well it really functioned. And I know we kind of learned that people were on their way out of the city for summer break, and which maybe explains how the regional airport that we were flying out of at San Juan, it was incredibly busy. You and I were standing there and the seats just being packed with people. But it really just it seemed people were just really excited and active. It took you 8 minutes just to get a bottle of water at the cafe in the airport because the line was so long. But I mean, it just seemed like, it seemed like a bustling economy, quite often, and a functioning economy.
I agree. I spent Saturday afternoon walking around the mall. Admittedly, it was hot and you get free air conditioning there, but I didn't see a recession. And I saw people with, carrying bags, not just sitting around, and enjoying the AC. They were shopping. The stores were full. And beyond that, to your point, I've always been struck by how Argentina is not even in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index. It doesn't qualify. It was in Frontier for a long time, along with Vietnam and Nigeria and what have you. But now it's a standalone country because they had it in Frontier. They upgraded it to EM several years ago. Then Macri got hosed in the primary, and they dropped it back out. And so Argentina is kind of a special case where the country is, you can see that it has developed market potential, not EM potential. They could simply leapfrog EM because this country works, and it has worked in the past, but you have to extricate this monster with its tentacles that sits atop of it in terms of the federal government. And, like I said, we'll see. We've seen these kind of flashes in the pans before, but the pink tide does seem to be going out on both the country and the continent. And if Milei can do things fast enough so that they take, maybe the patient resuscitates. And I think, we'd be surprised at how far these things can run when you think of how many decades it's been a mess. Like a coiled spring, the move higher in terms of both degree and speed can really surprise people.
Yeah. Koala, why don't you jump in here? What's changed over the last couple of years since you started traveling to Argentina?
I would say, first of all, everything is more expensive. Um, I thought that line from Paulo that you didn't even bother to look at the menu or even do the exchange rate math. In the prior times I've been to Argentina, you now do actually look. It's no longer like you're buying things at 3 to 5 cents on the dollar if you're using dollars. Um, you're not frowned at if you insist on using a credit card instead of actual cash by the locals. Um, but I'd say, look, there does seem to be an optimism in the country. There seems to be an excitement about have they finally made a turn away from kind of multiple decades of Peronism, populism, and some false starts, say under Macri, to kind of turn the corner. And it's a very unique country in the sense of, I think, from a Western perspective, and we'll eventually get to the mining side of it. Everyone in the West can relate to Argentina. They want to do business in Argentina. Everyone wants this to happen so badly from an international perspective. And there seems to be now the political will and courage in the country to really go for it. My question, as I brought up at dinner, and I think as I was thinking about when we kind of thought about the Argentine macro, not just the quality of the mining, is what comes after Milei? You have the midterms the second half of this year. Does Milei get a bigger share of the House? It's not necessarily a majority, but do you see gains? You have reelection. And then I think there's a question, and I think Americans on both sides of the aisle will appreciate this comment, which is when's the last time you had a political party win the third term after you've had just an absolute political superstar do 2 terms in a row? So the other question we have to ask is who comes after Milei? Yeah, Rishi, you can, if they try to change the rules on Rishi post Milei, that's considered expropriation and that goes to international arbitration. Well, ask First Quantum in Panama how fun our international arbitration is, or in many other jurisdictions. No one actually wants to have to use that parachute, even if it's in the legislation. So everyone wants this to happen. I think it is happening, but it's also a country that everyone so desperately wants it to happen that it's a little like copper versus all other commodities. Everyone's ready to believe the bull case a little more readily than if we were talking about almost any other country in the world. So you're paying for it a little bit already.
Yeah. And I will reiterate some of that conversation because, the three of us spending 5-6 days together traveling, it seemed like each day our enthusiasm and bullishness for Argentina and also the mining sector continued to grow and grow. And, all three of us are contrarians of some sort of aspect. And so we know when things get a little hot, like that's kind of when something could hit that tampers the spirits down a little bit. And so that's one of the questions I asked later in the week was, okay, what could cool this down? What am I missing here that could really slow this positive momentum for the country? And then, we got some feedback. We have midterm elections coming up later this month. There's some FX type of movement here as well between the Argentinian peso and the US dollar. Maybe, Paulo, you'd be best to kind of dive into that as well and what the ramifications of that could be. But then also the second term with Milei and what comes after Milei if he does win a second term, and to keep that going, because this isn't something that potentially is only going to take 6 years. It might take longer than that to really get Argentina humming again as a fully developed country. And so those are just things kind of on the horizon here people need to be mindful of. But Paulo, I would love to get into this, the October FX decision with the peso, and maybe talk to us big term and I guess layman's terms here, what that actually potentially could mean for the Argentinian peso.
So it's a good question. I would say, just keeping things very basic and brief, Milei has announced over the last 10 days, he reiterated his intention of removing capital controls and fully liberalizing the FX by the end of the year. He's been hesitant so far in his first year to giving a time frame because the plan involves multiple stages of effectively cutting expenses, generating a surplus fiscally, and beginning to pay down debt. There are a few milestones before the liberalization of FX can happen, but especially the renegotiations with the IMF. But they're headed in that direction, and I think the concern has been that removing controls too soon would result in a devaluation that could risk stability and return Argentina to a higher inflationary regime. It takes time to instill confidence, especially foreign confidence, after what Argentina's been through. And with stability comes, greater reassurance and growing reassurance that the reforms will stick at least for the intermediate term. I think Koala raises very fair points about what comes after Milei and the type of long-term investments that are required, especially in things like mining that we look at. You have to think 10, 20, 30 years out in terms of jurisdiction risk. And he's right as well about the Cobre Panama example in international arbitration. It's certainly a nice fallback position, but not one anybody serious in mining wants to find themselves in. With coming back to FX, I find it very encouraging where this is going on the FX side, because there are moments when these trends sort of hit a stride on multiple levels in macro, where if they were trying to do this while the dollar is screaming higher in a risk-off global type affair, you would have to discount chances of success. But given where the United States is in terms of potential dollar rollover come Mag 7 rollover and tariffs and Trump doctrine pushing capital back out of NVIDIA and big tech towards other regions of the world, almost like a capacitor discharging liquidity, that is a helpful tailwind to not only emerging markets, but especially Latin America, which tends to be higher beta to EM. So the wind is at your back and not in your face, potentially, assuming we actually get this dollar rollover. But just in the last few days, with Trump's conversations with Putin, we've started to see the market confirm this. Equities haven't rolled over to follow suit, but you can perfectly overlay the year-over-year change in the NASDAQ, for instance, with the change in the trade deficit. So foreigners' U.S. dollars are being recycled into Mag 7. That much is clear. So this kind of liquidity relief for the rest of the world in EM is certainly something we've seen before. The structurally weakening dollar in the 2000s that kind of enabled and propelled China's coming out party and the super cycle back then. Whether we end up in a rising tides lifts all boat for economies leveraged to commodities, we'll see. There's no clear demand coming out party. India is sort of in a spot where growth is cooling. Certainly higher oil wouldn't help them. It would hurt them. But oil is cooperating for now. So it's not easy and clear like the early 2000s from a weak dollar super cycle game on EM and commodity perspective. It feels more rotational than that as we adjust. But Argentina seems to be a key beneficiary, both from the agri side and also the attract investment for mining and oil and gas, to really capitalize on these reforms and get its house in order. So as you marry sort of the top-down, very 35,000-foot U.S. dollar FX macro situation with a reform local macro narrative, and then start looking even more micro at the industry and individual company opportunity level, I think things in that sense, like the ducks are lining up and the stars are lining up really nicely for Argentina to keep the momentum running for investors in equity and credit space. The interesting thing that I find that Koala sort of hinted at as well is the public market has run a lot. If you look at the ADRs for the banks, YPF, Pampa, these things are all 3-5x up in the last year and a half. Interestingly, the private markets have not moved. And I think this is a symptom of the fact that, the Apollos and Blackstones of the world have so much money that it's elephants through a keyhole for them to put money into the country. And they're also late because they've been busy trying to find exits from their Silicon Valley tech nonsense that's still mismarked and way above, public market exits, because public markets ultimately just the exit for private markets, right? And if you're mismarked, the bid ask is wide between private equity and public equities. And I think that explains the fact that despite what Goldman and other ECMers might say, there is no pipeline, a robust pipeline of IPOs here. Insiders are selling in droves as fast as possible, block trades, et cetera, follow-ons, but no private equity is running to bring stuff to market at current levels because they can't, because that would reveal that they're mismarked on the books.
You've touched on a great point here, Paulo, just to slide in here, which is Argentina. And without getting into specifics, I've noticed this on a few other mining things I've noodled on in the last 6 months. For those big institutions, there's still career risk.
Yeah,
No one wants to be the partner that lost Blackstone money in Argentina.
exactly.
That is a career limiting decision. And as we will touch on when we get to the company specific stuff, it's places where private valuations are in excess of public valuations that people are comfortable deploying capital. They'll deal with the exit, the conundrum of the exit later, whether that's through a continuation vehicle or selling to another fund. But that's a much bigger 10, 20-year question about how does private equity find a permanent capital home for most of the stuff that they've bought
100%.
and return capital to their LPs. But here, private valuations, and you and I talked about a few things, not just in mining, but other stuff in Argentina, the private stuff, they're like, yeah, it's a 10-year investment. Milei max 6-7 more years. So who comes after Milei? Very relevant conversation. No one's sophisticated saying, okay, I'm going to buy this, and within 12 to 18 months, I'm just going to IPO it and try to capture the uplift, because you still have to carry midterm risk. And could you get the IPO out the door before the question of will Milei get reelected?
Yep.
But that would be a fortune maker for someone who's entrepreneurial. But find me a firm that has the billions of capital and is going to reward a cowboy risk taker like that if they make that move and they get the 5x, which is kind of the uplift on some of these things compared to what we've seen. No one's going to have the courage to do that and risk the career, because it's not going to lead to a bonus the way it would have in the 90s or 2000s.
And it's precisely that skepticism and that concern around career risk that is showing us private deals at 2.5 times 25 EBITDA when equities have already 4 or 5x'd in the public market space. It's the exact opposite of what we see in the U.S., to your point. It's the assurance around jurisdiction and continuity over the last few decades that allows guys to lever up and crowd into valuations that could be above exit. And conversely, the opposite inflection appears to be underway in Argentina, but will require many years of stability to reward and re-rate. And a fortune to be made, as you said, if it works. And if not, you're cheap and hopefully the downside isn't one-time EBITDA and capital controls and the nightmares of the past.
Well, I mean, if it doesn't work, you're fired, career limiting. But at the end of the day, I think, and this is something that is a more finance broader topic, people need to, I think you kind of need to have a recognition at some point in your career. You got to actually take some risk if you want to be rewarded. There's
That's
been a
right.
huge commoditization across our sector, which you and I talked about quite a bit on the trip. And at some point, everyone's got to wake up and be like, just because you went to the right schools, went to the right program, checked all the boxes, everyone can see that well blazed path. And you know what? It gets crowded. It becomes like a traffic jam to the Everest summit. You got at some point, if you want to get rewarded in a special way, you have to take a risk or test a new hypothesis. Argentina privates could be something like that. But yeah, it's wild to see what we're seeing there.
Yeah.
Well, I remember, a couple days after the Philo deal was announced for the $4.5 billion deal, Canadian deal. You came on this podcast, and basically your first sentence was, "Some of us invested in Argentina, and we made money." And we need more of those stories. Specifically, we need more people to say the exact same thing over the next few years under Milei to really get continued, positive, more generalist type of capital, even some of the private big institutional money to come in and really see the writing on the wall. But I would say, I think one of my takeaways, obviously coming from the mining industry, I see those valuations, I see the deals being done and the work being done on the ground, and I'm very enthused. But what I was unaware of was some of the energy investments that have gone into the country as well. I didn't know this, and this is crazy that I didn't know this, but Argentina has the biggest reserves of shale gas out. It's sandwiched between China and Texas. I had no idea. And so
Vaca
obviously,
Muerte.
yeah, so YPF continues, and I don't know if you noticed this, but on the flight back home, I actually noticed a number of people wearing Halliburton shirts. And so these big companies are obviously, it appears that they're looking at Argentina for next round of, capex development and expanding their work. And so things are good, but again, we need more people to come in, whether it's this podcast or maybe other news organizations, other content creators, and say, "I invested in Argentina, I made money."
I think the
So
exact quote without pulling up was, "We invested in Argentina and we actually made money."
we
Yeah.
actually made money. I think you're right.
Shocker.
Yeah. So, let's talk about the sector, the mining sector here. I mean, obviously, there has been big investments in oil and gas in Argentina, but since this is mining stock day, we're going to stick with the mining sector. On the back of that deal with Philo and the relationship with Argentina, we were on the ground in mining country in San Juan province for a few days. We got kind of a glimpse of how those municipalities within the province are growing. We've understood that there's a lot of people being put to work in businesses that support the exploration development mining sector, obviously growing as well. Maybe, Qual, this goes back to you. I mean, are you seeing some of those rural communities really also get back on their feet and really expand and provide like a lot of assistance to these other companies, whether it be Aldebaran or Glencore?
I mean, they call them mining boom towns through history for a reason. These mines aren't exactly found in Westchester County
No.
anymore. So you find them in some far off land, and you think about the billions of equipment, specialty labor, the thousands of jobs, and what's the closest town? A town that probably has a the new workforce is a meaningful percentage of the existing population. I mean, isn't this kind of how Dutch disease sort of happens too in some areas? Because you inject this massive new industry into the local economy and it just dominates everything. The price of carrots goes up. And if you're not in the part of the mining boom, you fall behind. There's a lot of community ramifications to play out here, in addition to the overall just aggregate benefit. And San Juan is going to face up to this because, as I said at the beginning, everyone wants this to happen, particularly in the mining industry. Because if you think about it, the irony is the same way international borders tend to be designed um, based off of geographic, geological anomalies. It's funny enough, things like mountain ranges are where some very geologically fascinating things have happened, like copper porphyries. And I think basically every single Western and even Chinese mining company can look at what's happened in Chile, look across a valley in the Andes to now being in Argentina, and and be wondering to themselves, if this is what's over here, and we haven't really been willing to go over there to the east, even a valley or two, for the last 30 or 40 years in any material way. But we've looked all over here in Chile for the last 50 years or 40 years. I forget when exactly Codelco uh, was no longer had a monopoly on all of it. There's got to be a lot of stuff in Argentina. And every board and every executive and every investor, with Chile as the proxy and then Peru as another proxy, they can visualize this and the opportunity. I had someone say to me, because of the shining path, Peru never got developed the way Chile did. So the joy of Peru was you had geology from the 70s and 80s, and you were actually getting to develop it with 90s and 2000s technology. Paolo, you can maybe speak to your experience with Peruvian copper through your career to that point. But in Argentina, now you look around, you go, oh, Vicuña, Altar, Los Azules, El Pachon, Mara. There's a lot of projects that merit capital. We can discuss the orders of quality another time. That you go, yeah, if this was all in one country, if Argentina and Chile was the same country, a lot of these things would already be in production or be in development. It's
100%.
only because the macro is opening up that people are ready to make 30 to 100-year investments and partnerships with this country.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
Paulo, let's talk about San Juan province here, and specifically what you kind of witness with the province supporting the projects such as Altar. And it was really encouraging to see. It's not a small, I mean, it is a small community, right? So it seemed like it kind of reminded me of Nebraska, where I grew up in a small town where everybody knew everybody, but everybody supported everybody, whether it be, through business or just through kind of social engagements. But it was kind of fun to see, because you are kind of in wine country at the same time, right? And so these two can coexist. I didn't sense any like one or the other type of debate. It was, we can do both at the same time.
Yeah, one of the kind of educational points for me on the trip was the perceived similarities and parallels between the U.S. government vis-a-vis structure and Argentina's constitutional republic, with an incredible amount or large amount of regulation and governance delegated to the individual provinces. Argentina's real issue over the years has been the fiscal, the simple kind of, to Koala's point, why is the other side of this invisible line from Chile not developed, and then a few kilometers away, you're cranking out, millions of tons of copper a year, comes down to being able to take money in and out of the country. Really, in a nutshell, that's been the problem. The scleroticism that comes with, the past sins with Repsol and YPF and expropriation and taxation all stems from that kind of core issue. But the provinces themselves will vary in terms of their receptivity to mining as an industry. And San Juan, fortunately, and also kind of explains why there are things there, from Vicuña all the way down to the south with Altar and El Pachon, that this province has a history of being rather forward-facing and receptive to the mining industry that you wouldn't necessarily find in Mendoza, where you have a much louder environmental crowd, more ecotourism than San Juan, more wineries than San Juan. We all know Mendoza wines, or Chubut in the south. That's been a nightmare for Pan American Silver and Navidad. These things grab headlines, but provinces really do vary. And I believe it was the Fraser Institute that ranked mining friendliness as by jurisdiction at the state level across Latin America. And San Juan province has historically been number one or number two for many years now. I believe it's number two currently behind Salta, which is to the north of San Juan in Argentina. But that tells you that at the local level, there is support for this industry. It's been the scleroticism around being able to get investment into the country and profits out, particularly to repay debts and FX repatriation to multinationals. That's been the sticking point. So if Milei manages to fix that, then again, stars kind of align. I find it interesting from some of our conversations, including with the mining ministry on Friday, that they emphasize this point in several different respects. With regards to environmental law, for instance, the federal code has a baseline sort of threshold, right? But then each province can kind of toggle up more restrictively. Mendoza did so back in 2010 with their glacier law. And now they're looking to unwind that. But San Juan, generally speaking, has been among the more or less restrictive when it comes to implementation of environmental concerns and codes and such. I think these things make a difference in terms of if a global miner is looking at where to, if we agree, as Koala mentioned, that Argentina is potentially the next great frontier, like Peru and the DRC were in the 2000s, and this next decade belongs to Argentina from a perspective of mining. Where do you start? And San Juan is a first stop. And I think Koala's work on Vicuña and calling the takeout of Filo and the joint development with Jose Maria over the border was sort of like the firing shot in a marathon around this province. And in finance, it's usually pretty simple, right? People love a who's next.
Right.
So in a crisis, Bear Stearns went down, who's next? Oh, Lehman, oh shit, who's next? BAML, oh, who's next? Morgan Stanley, Goldman, European crisis, Greece, oh, who's next? Portugal, oh, who's next? The pigs, who's next in that? You get this positive momentum in terms of who's next as well in markets where Filo went off the board, home run, hat tip Koala for owning that. Who's next? Right? That's where I get excited is like, okay, light bulbs off, commercial buyers like miners looking for assets and investors in this space, the few of us who are still left and have survived, are asking who's next. And I think that's how we drill down. Sorry.
No, go ahead. Koala, so maybe that's the question for you. Who's next?
Well, let's see. Glencore probably has to make a decision on Mara, which they control and is effectively a brownfield. The way I understand Mara, it's a pre-strip and you need a tunnel to take it to the, I believe it's the Alhambra plant. I might have my name wrong, but there's already a plant there that they're keeping in fine working shape. So Mara will come before El Pachon, and that makes total rational sense. But what else is there? I mean, First Quantum has Taka Taka, which is a lovely project. I think First Quantum right now is preoccupied on delivering Kansanshi growth capital in Zambia, and also focuses on obviously trying to get Cobre Panama back in working order. But I think once Kansanshi growth capital is sorted and we have a little more clarity on Panama, I think Taka Taka will go ahead, but it's already owned by First Quantum. So who's next among the juniors? Well, we all know NGX is still independent right there in Vicuña, but I don't think they're next. I think it comes down to you look at Los Azules, and you look at Altar, which are both owned by junior companies. And I would say McEwen is a gold and silver producer, but Los Azules is on a whole nother scale to everything else in the portfolio. And I think the private valuation on McEwen Copper is a testament to that compared to the market cap of McEwen Mining. So, yeah, I think we probably visited what's next.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to note that this conversation between the valuations of these two projects was, we talked about it quite frequently. You have, McEwen Mining that obviously is in production, precious metals production, but also Los Azules, and that's, Los Azules being kind of private within that company. That company still has $1 billion valuation. So it's kind of debatable how that is kind of split between the production assets of Los Azules, which is just an absolute monster in itself. But then you compare that to Altar at just north. Well, it was a $200 million market cap. It keeps going a little bit higher, so probably north of that right now. And so you have this huge spread.
You're talking U.S. dollars, to be clear.
Yes, yes, and
Yeah.
So you have this huge spread between the two. And I should say, obviously, I work with Aldebaran here on the podcast here, and so I just want to make that clear. But it doesn't keep me from speaking openly about them. So there is this huge discrepancy between the two. Now you have a very junior company that's doing really good work, and then you have McEwen Mining that obviously is going to have a premium to it because of the name and legacy that also is doing really good work. But I would say John Black and his legacy is right up there as well, as far as taking brownfields projects, cleaning them up, developing them into something that is packaged well for a major to do it, and selling it before any sort of feasibility study, Lassonde curve deep trough is ever made, because that's what he's done before. And so I guess, that's just kind of me thinking out loud here. Like, how do we take these two valuations of these two companies, similar projects, very close in proximity? How are we supposed to kind of reconcile these two?
I think
Maybe
from
Paulo or Koala, go ahead.
I would say my first one-liner is it opens up a much bigger conversation about how much of junior mining and venture capital mining should actually be done privately instead of publicly, because the
Sure.
way markets have evolved now, people look at listed securities as liquid, no matter what stage of development or pre-revenue or revenue a project is. And it can be a huge distraction when one shareholder wants a little bit of liquidity and is willing to hit the bid on what is relatively illiquid, but still has some form of liquidity, and knocks a share price down 5 or 10%. And people then are like, what's wrong? What are people hearing? It's like, this isn't Google. This isn't Nvidia, like in terms of how much trades every day. I think, frankly, it's a question and a testament to, should more of this industry be done privately before it goes public? That's partially, I think, the valuation point. And this is copper to Paolo's point earlier. I think this is one of the exceptions in the mining industry. People are optimistic. Who's next? A private copper porphyry, Los Azules, with a platinum sponsor in Rob McEwen. That attracts a Stellantis. That attracts a Rio Tinto. That attracts major institutional investors, because they see the ingredients and they can say, this might take 5, 10 years to play out, but hey, I'm not going to have a share price and a share chart that I'm judged against. I'm going to be judged against the fundamental progress and the eventual exit.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's also a function of the length and depth of the tide going out on this sector specifically since the early 2010s, when so many sins were committed, capital allocation and growth-wise, particularly by the majors, that we all know the junior space in listed world. It's hard enough trying to put a private deal together to go drill holes in the ground or develop an asset. Doing this in the public markets, It's felt like the window has been shut with a handful of exceptions for so long that I don't know if necessarily there even exists the skill set of people in finance to be able to successfully underwrite these things in the public market, particularly one that's hijacked by flow and large cap and passive and everything else that people talk about on kind of like the market technical side. So therein lies the opportunity, because the prospective returns, as we know, are a function of the price you pay. The My quiet hope is that the management team at Aldebaran has the experience of having navigated the last cycle in the 2000s and put together an asset successfully for a sale to First Quantum, that they know what they're doing both on the geology and the packaging and putting a bow on it and getting the right tension in the room, which is not a done deal. Sort of a rich man's problem in attracting strategic investments is that you may make others more reluctant to move ahead with you. But on the flip side, the profile is out there. The right people are hanging around the hoop from a potential takeout perspective and among the majors. And it's up to management to execute the business plan, which I'm largely convinced they can do. And the ultimate exit will be a function of both their efforts and their ability, but also, we'll need a little bit of help from the market, in the sense that if an exit can be timed with, firmer economics around the project via PEA and PFS, in the context of a copper price that's finally taking out the $5 ceiling and on its way to $6, again, going back to the concept of stars aligning, I'm here for it. But no sure things either. And I just don't think that, I think it also goes to show you that, we all say selection is the key in this industry, because you're almost playing the man, not the market, in the sense that there are other options to invest in the junior space, but there are actually not that many. I remember Koala and I talking on site that, like, how many of these things are really left in the world, right? At least of this kind of scale and size and attraction to a major. There's not much. So at some point there'll be a land grab. Hopefully there's an exit for existing shareholders like myself. And I should again disclose I have a position in Aldebaran, and it's substantial, even for me. But we'll see what happens. I think it gets interesting after the next sort of wave of consolidation of major projects happens. There's kind of that long lead time. What addresses the, any sort of supply demand shortfalls or tightness in the interim in the coming years? And that's when maybe interesting things happen with the copper price stack. I don't know. But anyway.
Well, if you look back on kind of that incredible Philo run, and when you first learned about it and started digging into it and starting investing, did any of that, I mean, maybe this is more of a nostalgic question, but did any of that really trigger similar kind of, investment thesis / emotions last week as you're visiting Altar? Did anything trigger that? I've seen this before.
I think the landscape did, and the
Yeah.
flags. I mean, look, the funny thing when you look at a copper porphyry core, and I'm not a trained geo, Paolo's not a trained geo, you're not either, is I'm pretty sure if you put a 0.4% core in front of us versus a 0.6% core, I don't think the two of us could tell the difference. In fact, I think unless there's visible chalcopyrite, I don't think we could tell whether or not we should get excited. But 0.4 versus 0.6 is a big deal when it comes to these sorts of porphyries. I think what really resonated to me looking at this was not so much nostalgia for Vicuña, But the realization in the context of everything else out there, how much from the first time I ever heard of Altar was when Peregrine was bought by Stillwater for like $500 million in 2010, 2011. And the CEO of Stillwater talked about his VP exploration riding a donkey or a mule over this project area when he was a grad student. But what stood out to me though is in the current consensus copper environment, where does this sit in the hierarchy of where we're going to fill the copper deficit that's so consensus? And it's moved up the ladder and the rankings. And what I also realized is if copper goes to $5 or $6, just the torque and the awareness that maybe you don't want to own a copper producer for copper goes up 20 to 50%. Maybe you actually want to own the project that as long-term copper goes from 450 to 5 in real terms is going to look ridiculously economic and attractive in a jurisdiction that feels safe, that or is becoming safer, relatable. And then on top of it, like Vicuña, it's not about the first 10 years, 20 years. It's the fact that once this thing's running, it'll run for a century.
Mm-hmm. And I really don't want to like have a large part of this interview just kind of talking about all the good, positive Altar. I don't want to seem like we're just like, pumping the stock.
Well,
But
Trevor, I'll happily say that one of the things I'm still asking myself on Aldebaran to give the balanced view is with Rio sitting there as with an option to go to 20%. And I said this to the management team. Rio and BHP have the biggest checkbooks,
yeah,
the lowest cost of capital. How are you going to convince a different board to come in to buy the 60% of Altar that is represented by Aldebaran, knowing full well that Rio could outbid you, so it could all be for naught. And if you win an auction against Rio, either it's not as good as Rio didn't think it's as good as you think it is, or you overpaid Rio's sense of fair value. Now, there are ways to work around that. There's break fees. There's I don't know, do you have that deal happen someday in the future and you immediately do a private placement? So there's a break fee. And then if Rio comes over the top, the bidder gets an uplift on their private placement shares. There's ways to do this.
mm-hmm.
But one thing that was very unique about Vicuña was the clarity that Jose Maria needed Filo. And ironically, Filo, being a public entity, needed something like Jose Maria because of all the work that was going to be needed to be done to delineate Filo and engineer Filo to maximize the value of that ore body. That frankly, the public markets probably weren't going to wait around another 5-7 years or 10 years to see. Jose Maria had a grade cliff after year 10. But combined, you saw how 1 + 1 equaled 3 or 4, especially with BHP's interest in what will probably be their 21st century Escondida. Here, you don't have some of those dynamics that you had at Vicuña, but you have a team that's done this before, and it's going to be a really fun little dance to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, we're taking up most of the hour, and I know time's of the essence here on an active day, but I just do want to say it was such a pleasure to like travel with the two of you. I've known you guys for a little while now, but I've never spent a full week on the road with each of you, and so it was so much fun, and I just learned so much from listening to you and the other people in the group just kind of talk about the sector and things even outside the sector. I was just almost like a fly on the wall listening into a lot of it, but appreciate your time. Appreciate both of you. Thanks so much for sharing this insight and debriefing all of us here on the podcast about what we witnessed last week.
For sure. Yeah, it was great spending time with both of you on the trip. Koala and I have been getting to know each other over the last few months, and this was just a terrific opportunity for us to all be together. And, when you're in a pickup truck for 8 or 9 hours on a dirt road, you get to know each other pretty well.
Yeah, you certainly do. Do.
But no, it was great. It really was a great trip. I'm glad you guys that we were there together to do it and bring our own kind of unique perspectives and backgrounds to bear on what we were looking at, and also to spend time in BA and sort of experience what Argentina is and what it could be. It's been awesome.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, Koala.
It was an absolute pleasure spending the week with you guys. Bummer to miss Los Azules, but I think that time in Buenos Aires was very well spent and gave us a much better understanding of what's going on in the country as we're looking to invest more there.
Yeah.
That's right. All right, guys. Have yourself a great weekend. Thanks again so much.
Cool.